Our text this morning comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 21, beginning with verse 33. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. And when the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the Scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it's amazing in our eyes." The word of God for you, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. I understand there was a woman who was going to Rome with her husband, and neither of them had had a significant vacation, and they certainly had not gone out of this country, been saving for years. And so this woman wanted to have her hair done very nicely, so she goes to her hairdresser. And of course the hairdresser asked, "What's going on in your life?" And the woman began to tell her exciting news about the upcoming trip. And the hairdresser asked, "How are you going to get there?" "Well, we're flying United Airlines." "United? I bet you got a great price because it's such a terrible carrier." "Well, the flight crews are rude. They don't have good connection times. So where are you staying in Rome?" "Well, we're staying at a little place just out of Vatican City on the River Tiber, and I understand it's very exclusive." "Oh, I know exactly where that place is. It's a dump. You don't want to go there. No one wants to go there." "And now where are you going to go when you get to Rome?" "Well, we're going to visit a few museums, see the ruins. Hopefully we'll get to see, be in Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, and hope to get to see the Pope." And the hairdresser says, "Oh, Al, that's a bunch of tourist traps. You're going to hate all of that. You see one bad rock, you've seen them all. And you think you're going to get to see a Pope? Well, he speaks to thousands of people during every Mass. You'll be a little speck out there in the midst of all those people." Well, the next month, the woman returns to the hairdresser. And, of course, this is after her trip, and the hairdresser asks her with a snarl about her trip. And the woman says, "Oh, it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. Not only was the flight crew friendly, but United had just purchased new planes. And since the flight was full in the business and economy classes, we got bumped to first class, and the food and the wine was delicious." "Well, how about that dumpy villa?" Well, wouldn't you know it, they had just finished a multi-million-dollar renovation project. And it was beautiful with all the newest amenities, and we got to take advantage of everything. Since we were the first, they cut our price in half. "Well," muttered the hairdresser, "that's well and good, but I bet you didn't see the Pope." "Well, let me explain that. We were lucky there too. When we went into the Vatican area, they were bringing us in from back to front, and we were late, and we got put right in the front, and we were standing right under the Pope when he was preaching. And right soon as he finished preaching, a Swiss guard tapped me on the shoulder and led us to the Pope's private office. And he walked in, and I couldn't do anything but just kneel down on the floor, and he walked over, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he whispered in my ear. And the hairdresser said, "Well, what did he whisper? What did the Pope say to you?" And the woman said, "Well, he whispered in my ear, 'Dear Lord, child, who gave you that terrible hairdo?'" Have you ever been around negative people? They can just suck the life out of you. I mean, really. I mean, not only can they take the life out of a room, they can take the life out of you, and you feel like a balloon that gets pricked, and you just kind of go like this. They will complain about the taxes they have to pay after winning the $500 million Powerball. They're never satisfied with what they have. They focus on what they don't have. They never focus on where they are. They just focus on where they're not. My grandfather used to have a great saying. He said, you give some people heaven, and they would demand hell for potato patch. Now, isn't it tragic that some people go through life so negative and sour and bitter? And if you don't watch out, guess what? They'll infect you. One bad grape will spoil the whole bunch, and one bunch will spoil the whole vineyard. How can we live positively in this world where there is so much discouraging news? I think there's a clue in the New Testament, just one, there's many clues, but one that I focus on is when those hungry bellies were in front of Jesus that day, and Jesus wanted to feed them, and the disciples go out, and they can just find this meager lunch, a few loaves and a couple of fish, and they bring it back to Jesus, and all they see is a deficit. All they see is the deficit. And Jesus sees a smorgasbord. He sees the resource to feed them all. Jesus celebrated what he had. And that's an attitude. Make no mistake about it. Sour grapes are a killer. It kills hopes. It kills dreams. It kills truth and expectations. And not only does this sourness kill the grape, but again, it affects the entire vineyard. And sour grapes do indeed love company. And if they don't have enough sour grapes around them, they'll create some. They make some to join them in their misery. Now, you and I, we live in a very cynical world. It's a negative, dreary world. It's a violent, senseless world. And in some respects, it's a world that's gone mad. And even when there is some suggestion of goodness, it seems like we have to focus on the negative, on the badness. You can say 100 things positive about something, some circumstance, some situation, or some person, and there's always that one that will say what? Yes, but. Yes, but. Now, for instance, what happened in Las Vegas last week was absolutely tragic and terrible. I mean, it was pure, unmitigated evil. 58 lives were changed, ended. And there were 500 more that was completely changed because of one person. And we don't know why. But as I watched the news services, they constantly focused in on the killer. Constantly. And there were hundreds of people who performed heroic acts. There were spouses climbing on top of their spouse to protect them. There were friends dragging friends out of the line of fire. There were strangers riding to the hospital in an ambulance or in the back of a pickup truck, holding the hand of a perfect stranger. And that wasn't getting reported. And there was one reporter, dear soul, and I appreciated her. She said, I've had enough of this. On the air, she said, I've had enough of this. Let's talk about all these people. And she began talking about them, and guess what? They cut away pretty quickly to something else. Well, there's another illustration. The media shows a handful of football players kneeling during the national anthem. And what they don't show is the other 50 on the team that are not. They don't show the 100 on the field that are not on both teams, and the 50 or 60 coaches that are out there on those fields, and the thousands in the stadium that are not doing that. They focus in on what they think is the negative. Now, the reason they do that is because you and I are fascinated with it. We're fascinated with the negative. It gets the press, and they're going to give us exactly what we want. I love the honest sign that was put outside a town in New Mexico, and the sign reads, "Welcome to Portales, New Mexico, home of 12,493 friendly folks and 8 or 9 grouches." Isn't that the way it is everywhere? There's always a few negative folks around to tell you that Murphy's Law will ruin everything. Now, I like the story about the little boy who was raising some funds for the church, and he was going from door to door, and he was asking for used bottles, and he knocked on the door, and she was notably the town grouch. And he knocked on her door, and he asked, "Do you have any Coke bottles?" "No." "Do you have any old whiskey bottles?" "No." "Do I look like a woman would have old whiskey bottles?" And the little boy stood there and looked at her up and down, and he says, "Well, do you have any old vinegar bottles?" So the negative Nathans of this world go along justifying their sour grapes by pointing out the many times leaders have disappointed them or lied and misrepresented something to them. The Debbie Downers have felt the sting of betrayal from families and colleagues and friends, so they use these dark spots to justify their negative attitude, their feeling of constant despair and their caustic intentions. They hang a cloud high enough and dark enough to block out the light of the sun and ensure rain on any parade. I like the story that Dr. Clarence Bass tells. He was a professor emeritus at Bethel Theological Seminary, and he tells the story about being early in his ministry, preaching at a church as a visiting pastor, and he thought he had preached the best rip-roaring sermon he'd ever preached. And he got to the door, and person after person verified that, told him how great the sermon was. And then there was this guy, this last fellow in the line. You know who he is, don't you? Yeah. The last fellow in the line, he comes up to Dr. Bass. He says, "Dr. Bass, terrible sermon. Too long. You talk too soft. You use too many big words." And Dr. Bass apologized and said he was sorry, and he would work on all that. So the fellow left, and Dr. Bass turned to the pastor of the church and said, "Who was that guy?" And the pastor said, "Oh, don't worry about him. He just repeats what he hears." Yeah. Last week we learned of 2 sons who were asked to go to the vineyard by their father. One agreed and didn't go. One didn't agree and then went. And then the Pharisees were asked who did the will of the Father. Well, of course, the one who did not agree and then went. Well, this week we're back in that vineyard. We're back in the vineyard, and the vineyard is still owned by God. It's God's possession. But Jesus tells this kingdom story in a different way now. Now this owner has taken a vineyard, he's planted the vines in it, the grapes, and he's built a wine press in it, and he has waited a season for this vineyard to produce some fruit. And he sends his slaves to collect the produce, the fruit. And these tenants, these renters in the vineyard, don't want to give up the fruit. And they kill the slaves. Well, the owner sends more slaves, and then those are killed. And then the son goes, and they kill him as well. And Jesus is telling this story to the Pharisees, and he asks the Pharisees what they would do or what should be done, and the Pharisees are angry. They're angry. They're angry right up to the point when they realize Jesus is talking about them. They're angry with the story, and then they get angry with Jesus. Reminds me of that. You just see the movie, there's a Tom Cruise, Few Good Men. You remember that story? There's a scene in there where Colonel Jessup is on the stand and Tom Cruise is interrogating him. And Tom Cruise says, "I want the truth." And Jack Nicholson says, "You can't handle the truth?" Well, sometimes we can't handle the truth. We get angry about the truth. Why? Because it doesn't fit our narrative. We have this idea of what our storyline should be, what we want it to be, and when the truth gets in there, we get angry because it doesn't match what we like or what we want. Sometimes that truth tells us we're not who we should be. Sometimes that truth tells us that we're not what we should be, that we're not going to the right place or doing the right things. And we get angry. Instead of transforming, we get angry at the messenger, which was Jesus. The lesson on ownership of God's kingdom is a lesson we need to learn, or at least relearn in the Christian church, I think. For many believe they own the church, and it goes through all of Christendom. These people are stockholders with tithes and offerings. The church is not for God's purposes, it's for their pleasure. And when their pleasure doesn't get served, then they get angry like these Pharisees did. You know, all this comes in various forms. I pastored a small Mill Hill church in Spartanburg when I was a puppy in the ministry. And I was still at Walford. And there was a fellow at the church, it didn't matter what the finance committee said or what vote they had or the administrative board, we called it administrative board back then, and what the administrative board said. It didn't matter what I said. If we were going to spend the money, we had to ask Clarence first. Clarence decided whether we could spend that dollar or not. Why? It was his job. It was his money. He had claimed ownership of the vineyard. And it had to pass his muster before we could do anything. And then some years later, I went to a church that had exploded. There's another church in between this. It was in Spartanburg. And a fellow by the name of Mack had given 8 acres of property to the building of the church, for the building of the church. And they built a very nice complex on this 8 acres. It was a cotton field at one time. And a school was built here, and a 4-lane came through here. But what happened over time, Mack says, that was my property, therefore that's my church. I make the decisions in my church. You see where I'm going with that? Okay. It had become his, the ownership, the kingdom had become his. And the church had become for his pleasure, to serve his pleasure, rather than God's purposes. And then there's the other church I was going to tell you. We went to Columbia, and there was a little church there back in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. It had exploded because all those people out of Columbia were going for the suburbs. And this little church just exploded, and the locals didn't like it. They were upset. All these foreigners from Columbia were coming to their church. Okay. And over time, it couldn't handle the growth, and the church was falling apart. And they ended up having to tear it down. They built a 400-seat sanctuary. And told that they never have to build another one. Well, 20 years later, guess what? They had to build another one, 1,100-seater. Okay. Now we've got 4 groups that are angry in this church. Okay. And it went on and on and on until that church was actually comprised of about 6 different churches. And folks, they didn't like each other. They didn't like each other. And each one wanted their own way. Each one had their own pleasure purpose. Okay. And I remember going to a dear soul's house one day, and she was in her middle 90s, and I said, Miss, Miss Agnes, how are you doing? I'm doing fine, but I'm still angry. What are you angry about, Miss Agnes? Well, Miss Agnes said, well, they tore down my church. They did what? They tore down my church. What church was that, Miss Agnes? It was the little white clapboard church. Now, this was in the 60s. And I said, you talking about the one in the 60s? Yes, sir. They tore it down, and I'm still mad. Well, you know what? Her daughter, who was 12 years old when the church was torn down, was just as mad as her mother. And to make it even worse, the grandchildren were as angry as the grandmother. So they were passing down the sour grapes through the generations. Isn't that sad? And when I got there, it was so divided. It was terrible. They were fighting every which way you can imagine, arguing about which way to do, and it ended up doing nothing because nobody could agree to do anything. But the best thing that happened to us was when New Springs came into our back door. Church panicked. Church panicked. And I had a town meeting. It was not official. It was a town meeting. We all got together, and we were going to talk about the church. And we got together, and it lasted an hour and a half, almost 2 hours long. And they told about the fears of the church, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, I finally said something. I didn't say anything during all that, but at the end I said, what I see is the need for us to be the best church we can be. Let us be the best church we can be. Let us discover God's purposes right here in our community, and let's address those purposes. And let's forget about all these other things. Well, you know what happened? We had Mother's Morning Out started. We had classes to teach young mothers, which was the largest, fastest growing family group in our area, teaching them how to do their family plannings, the books, how to maintain their cars. All those things just popped up little by little, and there was ministries popping up all over that church, reaching out into the community. And you know what happened? The church started coming together because they stopped serving their own purposes, their own pleasures, and started serving the pleasures and purposes of God. It united them. It was wonderful to watch that. Now, it didn't take place overnight, folks, but it took place. But sour grapes are not just a local issue. It's a universal issue. It's everywhere. You see it not only in the living room, but it's in the political offices. It's in Washington, D.C. It's in London. It's in Moscow. It's everywhere. It's not just here. It's not something just experienced among lay people. It's in the bishops. It's in the district superintendents. It's in the pastors. There's sour grapes all over the place. And it's a disease. It's an infectious disease. And it not only affects the single group, but the bunch and the vineyard. But what I've noticed is sour grapes tend to be self-centered, like those people at that last church I talked about. They become self-centered. They become narcissistic. It's all about them. It's all about what they like, what they want, what they don't like, what they don't want, rather than what God wants and what God needs. Now, we get down to the question. We get down to the real question, don't we? Are you a sour grape? Are you? Ask yourself honestly. And more importantly, answer yourself honestly. Do I complain more than celebrate? Am I focused more on what is wrong than what is correct, more on the bad than the good, more on what you do not have than on what you do have? Do people feel better for having been with you, or do they feel worse? Do you lift people up and inspire them, or do you deflate them and drive them away? Or do others see in you the character, conduct, and attitude of the Galilean carpenter? Now, here's the frightening part in all this, and I'm going to be closing with this. The frightening part for me, at least, is what Jesus says at the end of this. He says what they have is going to be taken away. And I look at Christian history, the history of the Christian church. You know, it went from Judaism to Europe, to Greece and Italy, and then on into the greater Europe. When Judaism abandoned the purpose of God. And then the church held European society and culture together for centuries. And then it started dismantling. And then it came to the colonies. And now you can go to churches on every corner in Europe and nobody's there. You know. And the church grew and thrived over here in the colonies. And now we see the church not thriving so well over here in these colonies, in these states. But it's exploding in Africa, Southeast Asia, China, and Russia. And I wonder, is God moving somewhere else? I remember the first time I ever felt old. I was teaching a class at a college, and I said, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And one of the students said, who? Who was that? One of the most inspiring inaugural addresses I think ever given was his. And one of the most inspiring moments in that address were these words. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Well, we've come a long way since that was said. And I wonder if we don't need to say that in the Christian church. Ask not what the church can do for you, but what you can do for the purposes of God through the church. Boy, wouldn't that be radical? Wouldn't that be transforming? Now, although we can be changed at any moment in time, God offers us reconciliation every day, but mostly and more importantly on Sunday morning. And here in this hallowed place, God challenges who we are, why we are, and what we are, and reminds us of sacred grace, and calls us to surrender to Him what is already His, which is our talents, our gifts, our resources, but most importantly, surrender our souls, because we don't own them. God does. So that transformation begins on our knees in regret for having our pleasures first above God's purposes. We will inspire and become a wellspring of hope when the sourness of our grape turns sweet. We will draw people to Christ because divine love and grace will be seen in our lives. And all God's children said, amen.